Welcome, seekers of history and time. Today, we drift into the golden sands of memory, into a land where gods walked beside men, where stone spoke, and where eternity was not a dream but a design. This is the story of Egypt, the empire that rose from the banks of the Nile to shape the destiny of the world, a civilization of mystery, majesty, and meaning that stood for 5,000 years, defying the passage of time itself. So, sit back and journey with us beyond the veil of centuries as we uncover the complete story of the ancient Egyptian empire. The story of Egypt begins long before there were kings, before the pyramids rose from the sands, and before the great river became a symbol of divine order. It begins with a simple truth: where there is water, there is life. The Nile River, the world's longest, carved a ribbon of fertility through the endless desert. Every year it would flood, spilling over its banks and leaving behind rich black silt, the lifeblood of Egypt. This natural miracle gave birth to one of humanity's greatest civilizations, one that would endure for more than 3 millennia. But in the earliest days, Egypt was not a single kingdom. It was a scattered land of farmers, hunters, and fishermen. People lived along the banks of the Nile in small villages, growing barley and emmer wheat, tending cattle, and crafting tools from stone and copper. They learned to read the rhythm of the river, to plant when it receded, and to harvest before the floods returned. In these humble communities, the roots of Egypt's greatness were quietly taking hold. The early Egyptians began to notice patterns: the predictable rising and falling of the river, the movement of the stars, the turning of the seasons. They came to believe that the world was ruled by divine order, a sacred balance they called Ma'at. To live in harmony with Ma'at was to live in truth, justice, and balance. It was this belief that shaped every part of Egyptian life: their laws, their temples, even their view of death. Over time, the small farming communities grew into larger towns. Trade networks spread across the Nile Valley. Pottery, copper tools, jewelry, and textiles were exchanged between villages. With trade came prosperity, and with prosperity came ambition. Rival leaders began to emerge: warlords, chiefs, and kings who sought to control the wealth of the Nile. Egypt slowly divided into 2 lands: Upper Egypt, the long, narrow valley stretching to the south, and Lower Egypt, the broad delta to the north, where the Nile met the Mediterranean Sea. These 2 lands developed distinct cultures and symbols. Upper Egypt, with its rocky cliffs and narrow riverbanks, was symbolized by the white crown, while Lower Egypt, fertile and open, was marked by the red crown. For centuries, these 2 kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting. Each claimed divine favor. Each sought to unite the other under its rule. It was during this turbulent age, around 3100 BC, that a powerful ruler arose in Upper Egypt, a man named Narmer, also known in some traditions as Menes. He was more than a conqueror. He was a visionary. Narmer saw that the constant division of the 2 lands brought only chaos, and chaos was the enemy of Ma'at. To restore order, he waged a campaign of unification that would forever change the destiny of the Nile Valley. The battles between Upper and Lower Egypt are lost to time, their details buried beneath the sands, but ancient carvings tell the story in stone. On the Narmer palette, one of Egypt's oldest and most sacred relics, we see the king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt as he strikes down an enemy from the north. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing his rule over both lands. Between these images lies the birth of the Egyptian state, a single kingdom united under one ruler, one god, king, one destiny. With Narmer's victory, Egypt entered its first dynasty, and the concept of kingship, divine kingship, was born. The pharaoh was not merely a man, he was a bridge between heaven and earth. He embodied the god Horus in life and became Osiris, lord of the afterlife, in death. His duty was to uphold Maat, ensuring that the Nile flowed, the crops grew, and the people prospered. This fusion of religion and governance would define Egypt for the next 3,000 years. Under Narmer and his successors, a new capital was established near the place where Upper and Lower Egypt met, a city called Memphis. Strategically positioned, Memphis became the heart of the new empire, a place where the administration of Egypt took form. From here, the pharaoh's word flowed like the river itself, reaching every corner of the land. As Egypt unified, its people turned their eyes to the gods, seeking to understand the forces that governed their world. They worshipped Ra, the sun god who sailed across the sky each day and descended into the underworld each night to battle chaos. They honored Osiris, the god of resurrection, and Isis, the mother goddess who embodied love and protection. Every temple, every ritual, every prayer was a reflection of their deep belief that life was eternal, that death was merely a doorway to another realm. The Egyptians saw their land as a mirror of the cosmos. The east bank of the Nile, where the sun rose, was the land of the living, the place of cities, farms, and temples. The west bank, where the sun set, was the land of the dead, the realm of tombs and eternal rest. This duality, this harmony between life and death, order and chaos, became the essence of Egyptian thought. As centuries passed, Egypt grew in wealth and sophistication. The kings of the early dynasties built grand tombs at Abydos and Saqqara, precursors to the pyramids that would later dominate the landscape. They developed hieroglyphic writing, a complex system of symbols and images that captured not only words but ideas, emotions, and spiritual truths. With writing came history, administration, and memory. For the first time, Egypt could record its achievements and preserve its legacy for eternity. The craftsmen of Egypt began to master their art. Pottery became more refined, jewelry more intricate, statues more lifelike. The Egyptians learned to shape copper, carve limestone, and paint with colors that still endure today. Their architecture began to reflect their faith, vast temples aligned with the stars, colossal columns shaped like lotus and papyrus, symbols of life and rebirth. The unification of Egypt did more than create a kingdom. It created identity. People no longer saw themselves as separate tribes or provinces, but as children of the same land, servants of the same gods, subjects of the same divine ruler. This sense of unity gave Egypt stability, allowing it to flourish while other civilizations rose and fell around it. And yet, this early Egypt was still a land in the making, a civilization finding its voice. Its religion, though deeply spiritual, was still local and fragmented. Each town worshipped its own gods, Horus in Nekhin, Hathor in Dendera, Ptah in Memphis. But over time, as the kingdom grew, these local deities began to merge into a grand pantheon, reflecting the unity of the land itself. The role of the pharaoh became ever more sacred. He was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of divine order. His daily rituals in the temple were acts of cosmic importance, ensuring the rising of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, and the victory of life over death. His image was carved in stone, eternal and unchanging, a symbol of Egypt's divine stability. Life in early Egypt revolved around the rhythm of the river. When the floods came, farmers laid down their tools and turned to other tasks: building, fishing, repairing, creating. When the waters receded, they sowed their seeds and watched as green life returned to the valley. The Nile was not merely water, it was the heartbeat of the nation, the breath of the gods. To the Egyptians, it was a living being, a god in its own right. Along its banks, villages thrived. Children played in the shallows, women gathered reeds to make baskets and boats, and men tilled the soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen. The smell of earth and water filled the air. At night, families gathered under the stars, telling stories of gods and kings, of creation and eternity. In their minds, they were part of something greater, a divine order stretching beyond the horizon. Trade expanded beyond Egypt's borders. From Nubia in the south came gold, ebony, and ivory. From the Sinai came turquoise and copper. From the Levant came cedar wood and fine oils. The Nile became a highway of commerce, carrying not just goods, but ideas, art, language, and faith flowed up and down the river, binding Egypt together like threads in a tapestry. With prosperity came innovation. Egyptian engineers developed irrigation systems, channels, and dikes to control the floodwaters. Their understanding of geometry and measurement, born from the need to redraw field boundaries after each flood, would later inspire the construction of their monumental architecture. Every pyramid, every temple, every statue had its roots in the practical genius of those first farmers and builders who learned to harness the power of the Nile. But Egypt's greatness was not only measured in stone or gold. It lay also in its philosophy, its profound understanding of life cycles. To the Egyptians, time was not a straight line, but a circle. The sun rose and set, the river flooded and retreated, the crops died and were reborn. Even death was not an end, but a passage. This cyclical view of existence gave their civilization resilience, patience, and faith. Narmer's unification was more than a political act. It was the creation of a world view. The king stood at the center of the universe, the human representation of Maat. His power was absolute, yet it was bound by divine duty. If he ruled with justice, the world would remain in harmony. If he faltered, chaos isfit would return. Thus, every act of governance became sacred, every law a reflection of cosmic truth. As generations passed, Narmer's successors continued his work. They organized the kingdom into provinces called nomes, each governed by local officials loyal to the crown. They established systems of taxation, labor, and trade that allowed Egypt to thrive. They sent expeditions into the deserts and mountains in search of minerals and precious stones. They built temples to honor the gods and tombs to ensure their own immortality. The early kings were buried in elaborate mastabas, rectangular tombs made of mud brick, with hidden chambers filled with treasures for the afterlife. Inside, priests performed rituals to guide the king's soul through the underworld. They believed that through these rites, the pharaoh would become one with Osiris and take his place among the gods. As centuries turned, the people of Egypt began to look upon their rulers not just with obedience, but with reverence. The pharaoh was no longer a distant monarch. He was a symbol of hope, the guarantor of life's eternal order. Festivals were held in his honor, hymns were sung to his glory, the temples echoed with prayers that his reign would last forever. And in many ways it did. For though the faces of the kings changed, the idea of kingship remained the same. Each new pharaoh was a continuation of the first, a link in an unbroken chain stretching back to Narmer, and beyond him, to the gods themselves. The foundations laid during these early centuries would define Egypt's character for millennia. Its art, religion, architecture, and government all sprang from this original vision, the belief in unity, balance, and eternal life. From the mud brick villages of the early Nile, dwellers would rise the stone monuments of the Old Kingdom. From the first hieroglyphs would come libraries of wisdom. From the struggle for unification would be born an empire that touched the stars. And yet, as we look back across 5,000 years of history, we must remember that it all began here with the river, the flood, the people who learned to live in harmony with nature, and a king who dreamed of one Egypt. It is said that history is written by those who conquer, but in Egypt's case, history was carved in stone not just to glorify a ruler, but to preserve a truth, that humanity's greatest power lies not in war, but in order, balance, and faith. The first Egyptians may not have known the future they were shaping, but their hands built the foundation of a civilization that would outlast kingdoms, empires, and even time itself. When you stand before the Nile today, watching the same waters that once reflected the sails of Narmer's boats, you can still feel it, the heartbeat of eternity. The same sun rises over the same hills. The same winds whisper across the same sands, and if you listen closely, you might just hear the echo of that first dream, the dream of a world where man and God, life and death, earth and sky, are forever united in harmony. That is how Egypt was born, not in a single battle or decree, but in the hearts of a people who believed that life was sacred, that the river was divine, and that time itself could be conquered through faith, memory, and creation. The story of Egypt's birth is the story of humanity's awakening, the moment when chaos became order, when survival became civilization, and when man looked upon the world and saw eternity reflected in his own image. From that moment on, Egypt would never be the same, and neither would the world. When Egypt entered the age that would later be known as the Old Kingdom, the world seemed to stand still in wonder. The two lands were united, the Nile flowed with promise, and the gods watched from the heavens as human hands began to build monuments that would defy time itself. This was the dawn of the Pyramid Age, an era of power, faith, and creation, where mortals sought to touch the eternal. The early kings of Egypt had already begun to see themselves not as men, but as divine beings, embodiments of the sun, sons of Ra, destined to rule both the earth and the afterlife. Their palaces were the axis of the world, and their word was law. Yet, even in their divine authority, they understood one thing clearly, that death was not an end, but a journey. And to journey to the realm of the gods, one needed a vessel strong enough to withstand eternity. That vessel would be built not of wood or clay, but of stone. It began humbly, as all great things do. The early kings of the third dynasty built mastabas, flat, roofed tombs of mud brick and limestone. But one man dared to dream of something greater. His name was Imhotep, the royal architect, priest, and scholar who served King Djoser, the first great pharaoh of the third dynasty. Imhotep was unlike any man of his age. He was a thinker who saw beyond the limitations of his time, a visionary who believed that stone could be shaped into a stairway to heaven. Under Djoser's reign, Imhotep designed what would become the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, Egypt's first monumental stone building and the first pyramid in history. Layer by layer, it rose toward the sky, 6 giant steps reaching for the gods. It was not just a tomb, it was a statement, a declaration of divine power and immortality. For the first time, humanity had built something that could outlast generations. When the Step Pyramid was completed, it stood over 200 feet tall, the tallest structure on Earth at the time. Its brilliance shocked the ancient world. People from across the land came to see it, to marvel at the way stone had been commanded to defy gravity, to stand eternal beneath the sun. It was said that the gods themselves could see their reflection in its shining white limestone surface. The creation of the Step Pyramid transformed Egypt. It inspired awe, devotion, and ambition. Every pharaoh who followed Djoser wanted to surpass him, to build a tomb grander, higher, more divine. The race toward eternity had begun. As Egypt entered the 4th dynasty, this ambition reached its peak. A young pharaoh named Khufu ascended the throne around 2589 BC, and with him came a vision that would forever change the skyline of the world. Khufu ordered the construction of a pyramid so vast, so perfect, that it would stand as a symbol of divine order itself, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The sheer scale of Khufu's project was staggering. More than 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, were cut, transported, and placed with mathematical precision. The workers, skilled craftsmen, engineers, and laborers labored not as slaves, as some have imagined, but as citizens fulfilling a sacred duty. They believed that by helping to build the pharaoh's tomb, they were helping to preserve the harmony of the cosmos. The Great Pyramid rose over 20 years of tireless effort. At its completion, it stood nearly 500 feet tall, aligned perfectly with the stars and the cardinal points of the earth. Its proportions were so exact that modern engineers still debate how it was built. It was as if human hands had mimicked the logic of the universe itself. At the pyramid's heart was the pharaoh's chamber, a sacred space meant to house the king's body and soul for eternity. The Egyptians believed that the pyramid's shape mirrored the rays of the sun, guiding the pharaoh's spirit upward to join Ra in the heavens. Every block, every angle, every corridor was designed with cosmic purpose. To them, the pyramid was not a tomb, but a resurrection machine. When Khufu died, he was entombed within this magnificent structure, his body mummified and wrapped in linen, surrounded by treasures, food, and offerings for the afterlife. Outside, priests performed sacred rites to awaken his soul, and the people mourned the passing of their god, king. Yet they also celebrated his ascension, for they believed he would live forever among the stars. Khufu's successors sought to continue his legacy. His son, Djedefre, built his own pyramid north of Giza, though it was never completed. His other son, Khafre, constructed the second Great Pyramid, almost as massive as his father's, and beside it, he placed one of the most mysterious monuments in human history, the Great Sphinx. Carved directly from the limestone bedrock, the Sphinx bore the body of a lion and the face of a king, perhaps Khafre himself. It gazed eternally toward the rising sun, guarding the necropolis of Giza. To the Egyptians, the Sphinx represented divine power, wisdom, and protection, a symbol that blended human intellect with animal strength. For thousands of years, its eyes would watch over the sands, enduring storms, invasions, and time itself. After Khafre came Menkaure, the builder of the smallest of the three pyramids at Giza. Though smaller in size, his pyramid was renowned for its beauty and precision. It was sheathed in red granite, glowing in the sunlight like fire on stone. Together, the three pyramids formed a trinity, symbols of power, faith, and eternity that would come to define the very image of Egypt. But the glory of the Old Kingdom was not built on stone alone. Beneath the towering monuments, a society thrived. Artisans carved statues of exquisite detail, scribes recorded decrees and prayers in hieroglyphs, and priests conducted elaborate ceremonies to honor the gods. Egypt was a living temple, every field, every workshop, every home a reflection of divine harmony. The pharaoh's court at Memphis became a center of administration, science, and philosophy. Astronomers charted the heavens, developing calendars that predicted the Nile's floods with astonishing accuracy. Physicians studied the human body, creating remedies from herbs and minerals. Architects learned to measure angles, balance weights, and construct with precision that would remain unmatched for centuries. The wealth of Egypt flowed from the Nile, its floods feeding crops, its waters carrying trade. Surplus grain filled the state's granaries, ensuring prosperity even in lean years. Merchants brought cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, and copper from Sinai. The entire kingdom pulsed with abundance, stability, and devotion. The people believed that all this order, all this perfection existed because the pharaoh upheld Maat. As long as he ruled justly, the sun would rise, the river would flood, and life would continue in harmony. This belief gave Egypt a unity and strength few other civilizations ever achieved. Yet, even as the pyramids rose in splendor, shadows were beginning to form. The cost of such monumental construction was immense. The labor, the materials, the organization all demanded vast resources. Over time, the burden fell heavily on the people. Provincial governors, known as nomarchs, began to amass their own power, managing local resources and building their own tombs. The one centralized state began to fragment. But in the midst of this growing tension, the Egyptians continued to look toward eternity. Death, to them, was not something to fear. It was simply another chapter in the great cycle of life. When a person died, their body was preserved through mummification, a sacred process that reflected the myth of Osiris, the god who was slain and resurrected. The body was carefully dried, wrapped, and placed in a tomb filled with offerings, food, clothing, amulets, and shabdi figures meant to serve the deceased in the next world. The Book of the Dead, a collection of prayers and spells, guided the soul through the trials of the afterlife. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of mat. If it was pure, the soul would enter the field of reeds, a paradise where life continued in perfect peace. But if it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by the demon Ammit, and the soul would cease to exist. To the Egyptians, moral order was not just an idea, it was the law of the universe. This deep spiritual conviction infused every part of their culture. Their art was not mere decoration, it was communication with the divine. Their temples were not only places of worship, they were microcosms of the universe, designed according to sacred geometry. Their music, their language, their rituals all echoed the same eternal truth. That man was a reflection of the cosmos, and life was an extension of eternity. As the 5th and 6th dynasties came and went, the focus of royal power began to shift. The later pharaohs built smaller pyramids, less grand but more intricate in religious symbolism. The walls of these tombs were inscribed with texts, the pyramid texts, the earliest known religious writings in the world. These sacred inscriptions described the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, his transformation into a star, and his union with the gods. They were words of power, meant to ensure the king's immortality through language as much as through stone. But even the mightiest stones cannot hold back the tides of time forever. As resources dwindled and the authority of the crown weakened, Egypt's unity began to fracture. Local rulers grew bolder, priests gained influence, and the people began to question the divine perfection of their kings. The great system that had held Egypt together for centuries began to crumble from within. Droughts and low Nile floods brought famine. Without food, the people suffered. The government, strained by endless construction and declining harvests, could no longer provide. The temples fell into neglect, and the gods were said to have turned their faces away. Civil unrest spread like cracks through the once stable kingdom. The age of the pyramids, that shining symbol of divine harmony, slowly came to an end. Yet, even in decline, Egypt did not vanish. The old kingdom left behind something far greater than wealth or monuments. It left a blueprint of civilization, a model of order, art, and belief that would guide humanity for thousands of years. The pyramids still stood, unbroken, shimmering in the desert sun. They were proof that mankind could defy mortality, that through faith, knowledge, and will, one could reach eternity. When later generations looked upon the Great Pyramid, they did not see just a tomb. They saw the embodiment of divine ambition, the moment when humanity dared to dream in stone. They saw a civilization that had transcended its limitations, that had made the desert bloom and the heavens align with human vision. The Old Kingdom was, in many ways, the heartbeat of ancient Egypt, a time when faith and reason were one, when architecture became prayer, and when the boundaries between heaven and earth were blurred. It was the era that defined what it meant to be Egyptian, to seek balance, to build with purpose, and to believe that life itself was sacred. And though centuries would pass, though kings would fall and empires would rise, the memory of that golden age would endure. The pyramids would stand as the silent witnesses of time, monuments not only to the pharaohs who built them, but to the spirit of a people who believed that eternity was within their grasp. Long after the sands buried their cities, long after the winds erased their names from the stones, the legacy of the Old Kingdom continued to whisper through history. Every civilization that followed, Greek, Roman, and even modern, would look upon Egypt's pyramids and feel the same wonder, the same humility, the same longing for immortality. For in those colossal stones lies the greatest secret of all, that the human soul, driven by faith and imagination, can create something that never dies. The Old Kingdom may have faded into history, but its spirit lives on in the light of the sun that still shines on Giza, in the rhythm of the Nile that still flows with life, and in the hearts of all who look upon the ancient world and remember that once, long ago, humanity learned how to build. Eternity, when the glory of the Old Kingdom faded, Egypt entered an age of silence. The once unshakable empire fractured into pieces. The pharaoh's voice no longer echoed through the temples, and the mighty monuments stood as lonely giants beneath the desert sun. The Nile still flowed, but it carried with it whispers of hunger and unrest. The divine order mat seemed to have been broken. For nearly 2 centuries, Egypt was divided. Local governors, known as nomarchs, ruled their provinces like miniature kingdoms. Some were noble and just, others were greedy, ambitious, and cruel. The central government had collapsed, the royal treasury was empty, and the people suffered. Tomb inscriptions from this era speak of famine, theft, and despair. The poor robbed the rich, brothers turned against brothers, and even the sacred tombs of the dead were plundered for gold. The land of the gods had fallen into chaos, into Isfet, the very opposite of divine order. And yet, even in darkness, the spirit of Egypt endured. The farmers still sowed seeds when the Nile withdrew. Priests still lit incense to the fading gods, and somewhere in the south, hope was stirring once more. In Thebes, a rising city in Upper Egypt, a powerful leader emerged. His name was Mentuhotep Roman II, a man of vision and strength, destined to reunite the 2 lands and restore Egypt to greatness. Mentuhotep's path was not an easy one. Rival kings ruled in the north, each claiming the divine right to rule all of Egypt. For decades, the country was consumed by civil war. Armies clashed along the banks of the Nile, and the once fertile fields turned red with blood. But Mentuhotep was determined. He believed that Egypt could not survive divided, and that the gods themselves demanded unity. Through strategy, diplomacy, and the force of his will, he defeated his enemies and brought the kingdom together once more. When the banners of Thebes rose above the land, Egypt was reborn. The year was around 2050 BC, the dawn of the Middle Kingdom. For the first time in generations, the Nile flowed in peace. The temples reopened, trade resumed, and the people rejoiced. They called Mentuhotep the one who unites the 2 lands, a title worthy of Narmer himself. In his reign began a new era of balance, beauty, and prosperity, an age of rebirth. Mentuhotep ruled not as a distant god, king, but as a wise shepherd. He rebuilt the central government, re-established control over the provinces, and restored the old faith in Maat. The people, weary of war, found comfort in the return of order. They looked once again to the pharaoh as the protector of both earth and heaven. But unlike the rulers of the Old Kingdom, Mentuhotep saw himself as closer to his people, a servant of the gods, yes, but also a father to his nation. At Deir el-Bahari, across the Nile from Thebes, Mentuhotep built his mortuary temple, a breathtaking fusion of architecture and landscape, carved into the cliffs of the western desert. It was both a place of worship and a symbol of renewal. The temple's terraces rose like steps toward the sky, echoing the old pyramids, but its design was more human, more harmonious with the earth. Here, The spirit of Egypt transformed, no longer reaching for the heavens in defiance, but flowing with nature, with balance, with grace. Mentuhotep's reign marked the end of the first intermediate period and the beginning of stability. The priests sang hymns again, the scribes recorded history, and artisans filled the temples with color and light. Egypt's heart began to beat once more. After his death, his successors continued his legacy. The 11th dynasty gave way to the 12th, and under a new line of pharaohs, Egypt entered one of its most enlightened ages. The 12th dynasty, especially under the rule of Amenem had I, Senusret I, and Senusret Roman III, became a golden chapter in Egypt's story, not of conquest and colossal monuments, but of wisdom, creativity, and balance. Amenem had I moved the capital north from Thebes to a new city called Ichtoi, near modern-day Fam. It was a brilliant strategic decision, a place between Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing unity. From there, he reorganized the administration, strengthened the army, and established a system of fortresses along Egypt's borders. For the first time, Egypt began to look outward toward Nubia, the deserts, and the seas beyond. Under Amenemhat and his successors, Egypt expanded into Nubia, securing gold mines and trade routes. Expeditions sailed to the mysterious land of Punt, returning with incense, ivory, and exotic animals. The wealth of the world flowed into Egypt's temples. Trade caravans brought cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and silver from the Aegean. Egypt had become the beating heart of an interconnected ancient world. But the Middle Kingdom was not just an age of wealth, it was an age of culture and introspection. After centuries of chaos, the Egyptians turned inward, reflecting on the meaning of life, death, and destiny. The literature of this period reveals a deep, almost philosophical maturity. Works like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, the eloquent peasant, and the instructions of Amenem reveal a civilization that had learned from its own suffering. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom wrote of justice, compassion, and wisdom. They believed that true greatness lay not in power, but in harmony, in listening to the voice of the people and serving with humility. The pharaoh was still divine, but he was also human, fallible, mortal, and aware of his responsibility to his subjects. This introspection shaped art and architecture as well. The grand pyramids of the Old Kingdom gave way to more modest, elegant structures. Temples were designed with beauty and symmetry, often aligned with the natural landscape. Statues became more realistic, capturing the individuality of the human face rather than the perfection of the divine. Even the depiction of gods became gentler, more compassionate. The Middle Kingdom artists sought not grandeur, but grace. One of the most remarkable pharaohs of this era was Senusret Roman III, a warrior, king who expanded Egypt's borders to their greatest extent since the Old Kingdom. He was both conqueror and reformer, a man of action and vision. He strengthened Egypt's control over Nubia, building a chain of fortresses along the Nile to protect trade and secure the flow of gold. His image, carved in stone, is strikingly human, not idealized, but stern, weathered, and wise. It reflects a new kind of leadership, strength grounded in experience. Senusret's reign also marked the height of Egypt's bureaucratic sophistication. The kingdom was divided into well-organized districts, each with appointed officials, scribes, and priests. Records were meticulously kept, taxes were collected with fairness, and the machinery of the state functioned with precision. Egypt had learned from its past the chaos of the Old Kingdom's fall, had taught it the value of structure, law, and balance. The Middle Kingdom's influence reached far beyond its borders. Egyptian merchants and diplomats traveled to distant lands, carrying with them not only goods but ideas. They traded with the Levant, Cyprus, and even Crete, spreading Egyptian art, language, and religion. In return, they absorbed foreign influences, enriching their own culture. It was a period of exchange not just of materials, but of knowledge and spirit. Religion, too, evolved in profound ways. The old gods remained, but new interpretations emerged. The cult of Osiris, once the god of kings, became the god of all people. No longer was eternal life reserved for pharaohs alone now. Every Egyptian, rich or poor, could hope for resurrection and judgment in the afterlife. This democratization of faith was revolutionary. It reflected a changing world, one that valued morality over birthright and virtue over power. The temples of the Middle Kingdom echoed with hymns to Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Festivals celebrated the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The people believed that just as the Nile died and rose again each year, so too did the soul. The afterlife was no longer a distant paradise for kings, but a reachable promise for all who lived in truth. The art of mummification improved, the burial texts became more elaborate, and tombs were filled not with symbols of royal power, but with scenes of daily life: farmers in the fields, musicians playing harps, families gathered in joy. To the Egyptians, eternity was not some distant, abstract heaven. It was the continuation of the beauty they had known on earth. But even this golden age carried the seeds of its own decline. The later kings of the 12th dynasty, though capable, faced growing challenges. The cost of maintaining Egypt's borders, fortresses, and trade routes drained the treasury. Local officials once again began to accumulate power, just as they had in the past. And in the north, new threats were emerging: foreign tribes and traders settling in the Nile Delta, bringing strange customs and weapons. The final rulers of the Middle Kingdom tried to hold the balance. They built fortifications, strengthened alliances, and invoked the favor of the gods. Yet, as time passed, the central government weakened, and Egypt began to slip once more into uncertainty. The 13th dynasty saw a rapid succession of kings, some ruling for decades, others for mere months. Records grew confused, authority fractured, and the unity that had defined the Middle Kingdom began to fade. The once powerful pharaoh became a symbol rather than a ruler. The provinces gained independence, and foreign powers began to look toward the rich lands of the Nile. From the east came the Hyksos, a mysterious people whose origins are still debated, perhaps from Canaan or Syria. They brought with them horses and chariots, bronze weapons, and new ideas of warfare unknown to Egypt. At first, they came as traders, settling peacefully in the delta. But as Egypt's power waned, they rose, taking control of the north and establishing their own dynasty. The age of peace and introspection had come to an end. The land once united under Mentuhotep and glorified under the 12th dynasty was again divided. Thebes in the south remained under native Egyptian rule, while the north fell under Hyksos control. For a time, two Egypts existed once more. But even in defeat, the legacy of the Middle Kingdom endured. Its art, its literature, its ideals of justice and humanity shaped the generations that followed. The scribes of later dynasties would look back upon it as the model of wisdom and balance. To them, it was not merely a political era, it was a spiritual renaissance, the heart of what it meant to be Egyptian. The temples and tombs of the Middle Kingdom still stand today, silent and graceful, their walls carved with hymns to the gods and prayers for peace. They remind us that Egypt's strength was never only in its armies or monuments, but in its soul, in its unshakable belief that order could rise from chaos, that the human spirit could endure through compassion, and that life, no matter how fragile, could find eternity in harmony. The Middle Kingdom did not end in fire or conquest, but in quiet transformation. The world was changing, and Egypt would have to change with it. Soon, new rulers would rise in Thebes, fierce, ambitious, and hungry for liberation. They would drive out the foreign invaders and usher in a new age of empire, glory, and power. But before that rebirth, Egypt had lived through something even greater, the rediscovery of itself. The Middle Kingdom was the age when Egypt learned humility, when kings became human, when art found emotion, and when eternity became a promise for all. It was an age of balance, fragile, beautiful, and wise. An age born from chaos and destined to inspire eternity. The sun that once illuminated the brilliance of the Middle Kingdom began to fade behind a veil of foreign rule. The Hyksos, wielders of strange weapons and riders of swift chariots, had come from distant lands to claim the fertile delta. Egypt, once the eternal beacon of order and divine kingship, now found itself humbled. The north was lost to these new masters, and the proud traditions of the two lands were fractured once again. But Egypt is a civilization that does not die easily. Beneath the weight of conquest in the southern city of Thebes, a quiet fire of resistance began to burn. There, in the shadows of ancient temples and the whispers of the priests, the spirit of the true Egypt was being kept alive. The gods had not abandoned their people. They were merely waiting for the right moment to awaken again. Generations passed under Hyksos' dominance. The foreign kings adopted Egyptian customs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and even built temples in their names, yet their presence was a reminder that the sacred balance of Maat had been broken. The people of Thebes could not accept a world where foreigners sat upon the throne of Horus. The divine order demanded restoration, and that restoration would come in the form of a family whose courage would reshape the destiny of the world. It began with Seqenenre-Tao, the brave ruler of Thebes. His rule was short, but his defiance sparked a revolution. He rose against the Hyksos, sending messages to their northern capital of Osiris that dripped with irony and rage. The conflict that followed was brutal. Seqenenre died in battle, his skull later found bearing deep wounds, the scars of war against oppression. His blood became the seed of liberation. His son, Chamos, carried on the fight. He rallied his armies and struck at the Hyksos with ferocity, reclaiming parts of Upper Egypt and inspiring his people with visions of freedom. But Chamos too fell before the work was done. The burden then passed to his younger brother, a name that would echo for millennia, Ahmose-I. Ahmose was not content with half measures. Trained in warfare and diplomacy, he rebuilt Egypt's army, mastering the very weapons and chariot tactics that the Hyksos had once used to subdue his ancestors. With strategy, patience, and divine conviction, he launched a campaign that would drive the invaders from Egypt once and for all. The battles were long and fierce, fought across deserts, marshes, and cities fortified by years of occupation. But Ahmose would not yield. With every victory, the people of Egypt rose behind him, their faith renewed. Finally, the Hyksos' capital fell, and the foreigners were expelled beyond the borders. The two lands were united again. The Theban sun rose triumphant, and with it, the new kingdom, the grandest age of Egypt's story. Ahmose took the throne not merely as king, but as liberator. He restored temples, reopened trade routes, and rewarded his warriors with land and honor. Egypt's borders were secured, its gods appeased, and its spirit reborn. The wounds of the past were healed through the fire of unity. Ahmose's successors continued his vision. His son Amenhotep I carried the torch of reconstruction, focusing on rebuilding Egypt's infrastructure and religious order. The arts flourished again, the temples echoed with hymns, and the scribes chronicled the dawn of a new era. Under the 18th dynasty, Egypt transformed into a superpower, a land of wealth, beauty, and divine authority. At the height of this new age stood one of the greatest rulers in human history, Thutmose III, the warrior pharaoh. Under his reign, Egypt expanded beyond its traditional borders, becoming the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. His military genius was unmatched. Over 17 campaigns into Asia and Nubia, he forged an empire stretching from the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia to the fourth cataract of the Nile. But Thutmose III was more than a conqueror, he was a visionary. He knew that empires were not built by the sword alone, but by the mind. After each victory, he established alliances, collected tribute, and brought back knowledge and art from the lands he conquered. The spoils of war filled Egypt's treasuries, but the wisdom of other civilizations enriched its soul. His reign transformed Thebes into the beating heart of the ancient world. The temple of Amun at Karnak rose to unimaginable grandeur, filled with colossal statues, obelisks, and sacred lakes that reflected the heavens. Thutmose dedicated his victories to Amun, the hidden god, whom he believed guided his every step. In him, the divine and the mortal merged. Egypt's empire was not merely political, it was spiritual. The new kingdom was the pinnacle of Egyptian civilization. Power, art, religion, and philosophy reached their zenith. Pharaohs were no longer just rulers, they were embodiments of cosmic harmony, guardians of truth, and vessels of divine energy. The people looked upon them not with fear, but with awe, for through the pharaoh, the gods spoke to the earth. Yet, amid the might of warriors and kings, one figure stands apart, a woman whose name still glows with mystery and majesty, Hatshepsut. She was not meant to rule, daughter of Thutmose I, wife of Thutmose Roman II, and stepmother to Thutmose Roman III. Hatshepsut defied every convention of her age. When her husband died young, leaving a child heir, she took the throne herself, not as queen regent, but as pharaoh of Egypt. She dressed in royal regalia, wore the false beard of kingship, and ruled with wisdom and grace. But her reign was not one of conquest, it was one of peace, prosperity, and beauty. Hatshepsut focused on trade, architecture, and art. She sent expeditions to Punt, reviving the ancient trade networks of incense, gold, and exotic goods. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari stands as one of the most exquisite structures in Egypt, a symphony of stone that merges with the cliffs of the western desert. Hatshepsut's Egypt was a vision of divine balance, the feminine and masculine united in harmony. She claimed her right to rule by divine birth, saying that Amun himself had chosen her. Her people prospered, her temple shone, and her memory endured even when later kings tried to erase her name. Time itself could not silence the echo of her greatness. After her death, Thutmose Roman III reclaimed the throne and continued Egypt's expansion. But the seeds planted during Hatshepsut's reign, art, diplomacy, architecture continued to bloom. Egypt entered a period of cultural perfection, where the temples of Karnak and Luxor became living embodiments of eternity. The priests of Amun grew powerful, their influence rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. It was during this delicate balance between divine and mortal power that another extraordinary king arose, Amenhotep Roman III, known as the Magnificent. Under his rule, Egypt reached the height of peace and prosperity. Gold flowed from Nubia, trade reached every corner of the known world, and art flourished with new elegance. Amenhotep saw himself as a living god, a sun upon the earth, and his reign became a golden age of luxury and light. The architecture of Amenhotep Roman III reflected his divine vision. He built grand temples, colossal statues, and the magnificent palace complex of Malkata. His reign produced the Colossi of Memnon, two immense stone figures that still guard the Theban plain. But behind the splendor lay a subtle shift. Egypt had grown wealthy beyond measure, yet with wealth came complacency. The balance between devotion and pride began to waver. From this environment of abundance and divine kingship emerged a figure who would change Egypt forever, Amenhotep Roman IV, later known as Akhenaten. He was not content with the old order. He saw the power of the priests of Amun as a threat to the throne and believed that the many gods of Egypt had distracted humanity from the true divine essence. So he proclaimed a revolution, one that would shake the foundations of Egyptian faith. Akhenaten declared that there was only one god, Aten, the sun disk, whose light touched all life. He abandoned Thebes and built a new capital called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. There, he ruled as the living prophet of a new religion, one that emphasized simplicity, sunlight, and personal devotion. Under Akhenaten, art transformed. The stiff formalism of earlier dynasties gave way to fluid, naturalistic forms. Scenes depicted the royal family not as divine symbols, but as human beings laughing, embracing, and playing with their children beneath the radiant hands of Aten. It was a moment of breathtaking intimacy in Egyptian history, a glimpse into the human soul behind the divine mask. But Akhenaten's revolution came at a price. By focusing on his spiritual vision, he neglected Egypt's empire. Foreign territories rebelled, trade faltered, and the priests he suppressed grew resentful. The people, confused and alienated, longed for the stability of the old gods. When Akhenaten died, his city was abandoned, his faith erased, and his name nearly forgotten until modern archaeologists rediscovered his strange, beautiful world centuries later. After his death, a young boy ascended the throne, one who would become the most famous pharaoh of all, Tutankhamun. Though he ruled only a short time, his reign marked the restoration of the old order. The gods of Egypt returned, the temples reopened, and the capital moved back to Thebes. His advisors, particularly the general Horemheb, guided Egypt back to stability. Tutankhamun's greatest legacy, however, came not in life but in death. When his nearly untouched tomb was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, the world was mesmerized. The treasures found within gold masks, jeweled thrones, and chariots of glory revealed the unimaginable splendor of the new kingdom. Tutankhamun became a symbol of eternity, his young face immortalized as the golden image of ancient Egypt itself. After his death, Horemheb took power, restoring full order and erasing the traces of the Amarna heresy. He set the stage for the next dynasty, one that would bring Egypt to the height of its imperial power. From its ranks rose Ramses I, followed by Seti I, and ultimately by the legendary Ramses Roman II, known to history as Ramses the Great. Ramses Roman II's reign was one of epic proportions. He ruled for over 60 years, commanding vast armies, constructing monumental temples, and inscribing his victories across the land. His battle at Kadesh against the Hittites became one of the most famous military encounters of the ancient world, not for conquest, but for diplomacy. Though neither side claimed a decisive victory, Ramses turned the event into legend, declaring himself triumphant and immortalizing the battle on temple walls across Egypt. He signed one of the first known peace treaties in human history, forging stability between Egypt and its northern rivals. Under his rule, Egypt's empire flourished. He built Abu Simbel, with colossal statues carved into the cliffs of Nubia, 4 giant images of himself gazing eternally over the desert. These temples were not only monuments to ego, but symbols of divine endurance. Ramses was not merely a warrior, he was a builder, a father of over 100 children, and a god, king who ruled as though he were eternal. His temples at Luxor, Karnak, and Thebes expanded Egypt's sacred landscape to its greatest extent. His image became synonymous with divine kingship, and even after his death, his name was revered as that of a demigod. Under Ramses Roman II, Egypt stood at the peak of its power, but time is the enemy even of gods. After his passing, Egypt began to wane once more. The immense costs of empire, the pressure of foreign powers, and the corruption of priestly and bureaucratic elites began to erode the state from within. The glory of the new kingdom gave way to the shadows of decline, yet even as its power faded, the achievements of this era remained eternal: the temples, the art, the literature, the vision of a civilization that saw eternity in every breath of life. The New Kingdom was Egypt's grand song, a symphony of conquest, faith, and beauty that still resonates through time. It was the age when the gods walked among men, when stone spoke, and when the desert itself seemed to whisper the names of kings. It was the golden empire of the Nile, shining, unbroken, and divine. When the sun of Ramses the Great finally set over the western horizon, its golden rays lingered upon a land still magnificent but weary. Egypt, once the heart of the ancient world, stood at the height of its power, vast, splendid, and eternal in appearance. Yet beneath that glory, invisible cracks began to form. The empire that had conquered nations and built temples to eternity was beginning to devour itself from within. The long reign of Ramses II had brought both stability and exhaustion. His monuments were colossal, his projects unending, and his wars costly. The treasuries of Egypt were drained by construction and tribute, and though peace with the Hittites had brought decades of stability, the cost of maintaining Egypt's borders grew unbearable. After Ramses' death, his heirs inherited a kingdom burdened with debt, aging infrastructure, and growing unrest. His successor, Merneptah, faced an empire under siege not by the grand armies of kings, but by desperation itself. Famine swept across the Mediterranean. The so-called Sea Peoples, mysterious tribes displaced from their homelands by hunger and chaos, descended upon Egypt's shores like a storm. They came by land and sea, burning cities and toppling kingdoms across the ancient world. The Hittites fell, the Mycenaeans vanished, and even mighty Ugarit was reduced to ash. Egypt stood as the last pillar of civilization amid a collapsing world. Merneptah fought valiantly. His inscriptions boast of victory, of the Sea Peoples scattered and defeated, of Egypt preserved by divine will. Yet these victories were not triumphs of conquest, they were acts of survival. The world was changing, and Egypt was no longer the unstoppable power it had once been. The following pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties struggled to maintain what their ancestors had built. Civil wars, conspiracies, and priestly power struggles consumed the court. The gods, once united under Mad, now seemed to compete for devotion and wealth. The priests of Ammon, now immensely powerful, controlled vast lands and resources. The balance between the crown and the temple, between king and god, tilted dangerously. In the reign of Ramses III, Egypt faced the final wave of the Sea Peoples. He fought them with courage, leading his armies in fierce battles that pushed the invaders back into the sea. Reliefs from his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu still depict the chaos of those wars, ships clashing, arrows flying, and foreign invaders overwhelmed by Egyptian might. Once again, Egypt survived, but survival came at a cost. Ramses III's victories could not mask the decay within. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Laborers at Deir el-Medina, who built the royal tombs, went on strike, the first recorded strike in human history, because they had not been paid. The divine system that had once promised cosmic order now seemed hollow. The tombs of pharaohs were robbed, the sanctuaries of gods plundered. The illusion of eternity was crumbling. After Ramses III's death, assassinated in a harem conspiracy, Egypt entered an age of fragmentation. The 20th dynasty collapsed under weak rulers and economic decline. The treasury was empty, and the Nile's floods grew unpredictable. In this chaos, power slipped from the pharaoh's hands and fell into the grasp of the priests. By the time of the 21st dynasty, the empire was divided once again, not between foreign invaders, but between Egyptian factions themselves. In Thebes, the high priests of Ammon ruled Upper Egypt, while in the Delta, Tanis became the new capital under a separate line of kings. The pharaoh was no longer the unchallenged son of the gods, but a shadow of former glory, sharing power with holy men whose authority came not from the throne but from the temple. And yet, through this slow decline, the Egyptian soul endured. The people still prayed to Amun, Ra, and Osiris. They still built small temples and offered incense to the gods. The scribes continued to write. The artisans still painted scenes of eternity on tomb walls, and the farmers still depended on the rhythm of the Nile. Life went on quieter, smaller, but alive. Foreign powers, however, began to take notice. Egypt's wealth, though diminished, still shimmered in the imagination of others. From the south, Nubia, once a vassal state, began to grow powerful. Its kings, inspired by the legacy of Egypt, built temples in the same style, worshipped the same gods, and adopted the same divine titles. Egypt's own culture had spread beyond its borders, and now that reflection would return with force. From the east came new threats, the rising powers of Assyria and Babylon, empires built on conquest and cruelty. Their kings sent envoys to Egypt, sometimes in friendship, sometimes in warning. Egypt, now a weakened lion, still roared, but her claws had grown dull. During the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt became a land of shifting alliances and divided dynasties. Kings ruled in name while generals, priests, and foreign mercenaries controlled the real power. The Libyans, who had long served as soldiers in the Egyptian army, began to establish their own dynasties. The 22nd dynasty, founded by Shoshenq I, a Libyan warlord, ruled Egypt for nearly 2 centuries. Shoshenq sought to restore Egypt's old glory. He campaigned into Palestine, capturing cities and asserting dominance over the Levant once more. His name even appears in the Bible as Shishak, the king who plundered Jerusalem. Yet even his victories could not revive the empire's spirit. Egypt had become a patchwork of provinces and local powers, each clinging to fragments of the past. The Theban priests continued to worship Amun with lavish ceremonies, but their influence was confined to the south. The once mighty temples of Karnak and Luxor echoed with hollow hymns. The sacred statues of the gods were paraded through empty streets, their processions a faint echo of former grandeur. Then, from the south, the Nubians rose. Their kings, ruling from Napata, looked northward with reverence. To them, Egypt was not an enemy but a sacred inheritance, the birthplace of gods, the mother of civilization. Around 750 BCE, King Pi of Nubia launched a campaign to reunite the two lands. He conquered Egypt not through destruction, but through faith. He restored temples, honored the gods, and presented himself as the rightful heir to the pharaohs of old. Thus began the 25th dynasty, the Nubian or Kushite dynasty, a moment of cultural revival. For a brief time, Egypt's ancient spirit flickered again. The Nubian pharaohs rebuilt temples, recarved the names of the gods, and brought back the purity of old rituals. They saw themselves as restorers, not conquerors, guardians of a sacred legacy that had been forgotten. But the world had changed. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was rising, ruthless, vast, and relentless. Its kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, and Sennacherib, looked upon Egypt with hunger. When the Nubian pharaohs tried to support rebellions in the Levant, Assyria responded with devastating force. The Assyrians invaded Egypt in 671 BC. Their iron weapons and disciplined armies crushed the Egyptian forces. Memphis was captured, temples were looted, and the pharaoh Taharka fled to the south. The gods of Egypt seemed silent as the statues were broken and the palaces burned. For the first time, Egypt was not just invaded, it was subdued. Though the Assyrians eventually withdrew, they left Egypt fractured once more. In the Delta, local rulers rose with their backing, giving birth to the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate period. Under kings like Psamtik I and Necho-Roman II, Egypt experienced a brief but shining renaissance. The Pharaohs sought to revive the ancient ways. They rebuilt temples, revived hieroglyphic writing, and restored the old art styles. They looked back to the old and new kingdoms for inspiration, hoping to recapture the spirit of eternity. Their reign saw the return of prosperity through trade with Greece and Phoenicia. The Nile Delta became a hub of commerce once again, and foreign mercenaries served in the Egyptian army. For a time, it seemed as if Egypt might rise again. The cities were full of life, the temples shone with new carvings, and the scribes once again filled their scrolls with hymns to the gods. But fate was already moving against them. To the east, a new power was rising, the Persian Empire, led by the unstoppable Cyrus the Great and later Cambyses Roman II. In 525 BCE, the Persians invaded Egypt. The Sate King Psamtik Roman III fought bravely but was defeated at Pelusium. Egypt fell, and for the first time in its history, it became a province of a foreign empire. The Persians ruled with tolerance but firmness. They respected Egypt's gods and temples, yet the people knew the truth: the throne of the pharaoh was now a seat of foreign kings. The Persians taxed the land, garrisoned their armies, and used Egypt as a jewel in their imperial crown. To the Egyptians, this was not divine rule but humiliation. Over the next 2 centuries, Egypt rebelled repeatedly, sometimes winning brief independence, only to fall again. The once unbreakable cycle of rebirth that had defined Egypt's story now became a struggle for survival. And then, from the west, came another storm led by a young conqueror whose name would echo through all of history. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. The people, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. The priests hailed him as the son of Ammon, and he was crowned pharaoh in Memphis. Alexander, wise beyond his years, understood Egypt's soul. He honored its gods, visited its temples, and founded a new city on the coast, Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Under Alexander and his successors, the Ptolemies, Egypt entered a new age, one not of pure Egyptian blood, but of fusion. The Ptolemaic rulers were Macedonian Greeks, yet they embraced Egyptian religion and portrayed themselves as pharaohs. They built temples to the old gods, wrote inscriptions in hieroglyphs, and ruled in the name of man. For a while, Egypt flourished again. Alexandria became the center of knowledge, home to the great library, where scholars from every corner of the world gathered to study philosophy, science, and art. The blending of Greek and Egyptian cultures produced new forms of art, religion, and thought. The goddess Isis spread across the Mediterranean, worshipped from Egypt to Rome, but time, as always, demanded its due. The Ptolemaic dynasty, though glorious, was consumed by its own rivalries. Brothers and sisters fought for power. Assassinations and betrayals became common. The empire that had once been eternal now bowed to politics and foreign influence. In the final chapter of Egypt's ancient story stood one woman, the last pharaoh, the embodiment of its fated majesty, Cleopatra. Romans 7. Brilliant, cunning, and proud, Cleopatra ruled with both intellect and charm. She sought to restore Egypt's independence through diplomacy and love, allying herself first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony. For a moment, it seemed as if the ancient magic might rise again, the Nile's queen and Rome's general united against the tide of empire. But destiny favored the legions of Octavian, the future Augustus. In 30 BC, after the defeat at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. With their deaths, Egypt, the land of gods and kings, of pyramids and pharaohs, fell under Roman rule. The banner of the pharaoh was lowered, and the eagle of Rome rose above the Nile. The temples remained, the priests still whispered the old prayers, but the divine kingship of Egypt was no more. The age of the pharaohs had ended. Yet, though time buried their cities in sand, Egypt never truly died. its monuments endured, its language carved in stone, its gods immortalized in art. The pyramids still touched the sky, the temples still stood by the river, and the name of Egypt continued to inspire awe in the hearts of all who beheld its legacy. For 5,000 years, Egypt had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the coming of conquerors, and the passing of empires. And through it all, it had taught the world a timeless truth that no matter how powerful, no empire lasts forever. Only the idea of eternity endures. The story of ancient Egypt is not just the story of kings and battles, but of humanity's yearning for meaning, the dream that life can transcend death, that order can rise from chaos, that the human spirit can carve its name into eternity. And as the Nile continues to flow, it carries with it the memory of that dream, the whisper of the pharaohs, the hymn of the gods, and the eternal promise that Egypt, though fallen, will forever live. The Roman banners rose over the land once ruled by the sons of Ra, and with them came a new order. Egypt, though conquered, remained luminous. Its temples, pyramids, and monuments stood as defiant reminders that time might conquer kings, but never the spirit of a civilization that had once called itself eternal. When Octavian became Augustus and declared Egypt a province of Rome, the world believed the story of the pharaohs had ended. But in truth, the story had only changed form. Egypt, as it had always done, transformed and endured. In the centuries that followed, the old gods whispered still in the desert wind. The temples at Philae, Dendera, and Edfu continued to echo with prayers. Pilgrims came to the sanctuaries of Isis and Osiris, leaving offerings as they had done for 3,000 years. Even as Latin and Greek filled the streets of Alexandria, even as Roman governors ruled from marble villas, the people of the Nile carried in their hearts the old rhythms of eternity. Rome, for all its power, fell under Egypt's spell. The conquerors became the admirers. The emperors themselves sought to claim the aura of divine kingship that the pharaohs had once embodied. Augustus restored ancient temples, not out of faith, but out of reverence for the mystery that clung to their walls. Later emperors, Hadrian, Trajan, and even the great Constantine visited Egypt, marveling at the monuments that dwarfed their legions. The obelisks of Thebes